Okay. Good morning, guys. I'm really excited actually about my conversation this morning with Lauren Wells because she is going to talk to us about all things TCKs. And I know a lot of us have a lot of these questions. So, Lauren, thanks for hanging out with us this morning. We had a little issue with Facebook Live, so we're just doing this on Zoom, and I'll throw up the recording later. So, anyway, Lauren, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, first of all, some people are going to be familiar with you and the resources that you have given people over the years, but just for those that don't, give us a little debrief on who you are and what you've been doing.
Yeah, so I am the founder and director of a company called TCK Training. And the purpose of TCK Training is to really equip and empower parents and then also the organizations and agencies that send families to live overseas to really care well for the socio-emotional health of TCKs and that family relationship dynamic and all those different areas that sometimes get missed in the logistics of
Yeah.
moving, and there's just so many things going on. And so trying to make sure that we're caring well for the emotional health of TCKs and doing that from the perspective of what do we see TCKs as adults really struggling with that's connected to that TCK globally mobile upbringing, and then how can we really address those things while they're young instead of just saying, well, I hope that doesn't happen to my kid.
Right.
Saying,
Right.
well, how can we actually be proactive about it while your kid is 6 or 15 or that sort of thing. So that's my organization. Again, I serve both parents and organizations, sometimes TCKs directly through debriefing and that sort of thing. But I absolutely love what I do.
That's fantastic. Yeah, one of the things I loved, I sat in the way that I met you was I sat in on a webinar about, I guess it was a month ago. And one of the things I really appreciated is you do have this really broad expertise. We're not talking about just, transitioning TCKs to college or transitioning little ones. So your experience is really vast. So I want to start there. Is
Yeah.
different kids are going to have different processes. We have 5 kids. They currently are all teenagers, and we transitioned to the States about a year and a half ago. So, against all conventional wisdom, we transitioned teenagers to America in 2020. So we did all of it wrong, but here we are. So, talk to us a little bit about I don't want to say necessarily stages, but maybe processes of transition that you typically see. And does it have to go in a sequential order?
So, no, not at all. And you didn't do anything wrong. There are always things that are challenging about a transition, no matter what. I also am a big believer in the idea and kind of philosophy that no matter what age you transition with, there are things that are going to be good and things that are going to be hard about it. So, for example, and this kind of goes along with your question, when you're transitioning with really young children, the positive part of that is that their primary attachments are within their nuclear family. So they're transitioning with those attachments, and that's really helpful. On the other side, they're transitioning during the stage when their brain is going through the most development. And so you have to be really intentional about making sure that you're optimizing development because that's when the bulk of it's happening in their life. But with teenagers, you're transitioning at a time when their primary attachments are maybe outside the nuclear family or both. And so it's really important to focus with them on identity, belonging, grief processing, all those different things. And it's less about the physical brain development, that sort of thing is pretty much over. And now you're working on more of the emotional health, teaching them how to process things, teaching them how to really grieve well, all these different aspects. And so it just changes. It's not that one is better and one is worse or one's harder. It doesn't really make a difference. It's just that how you are intentional changes. And so you would do things differently for a 4-year-old in transition than you would for a 14-year-old in transition.
Yeah, and so that is one of the things I want to get some specifics on is that you even look, I mean, each of our children, some of our kids cried, some of our kids were excited to experience a new country, being America, and then 9 months later, they got really
Mhm.
grumpy. And so, what are some things that you feel like we can be looking for that we might not intuit? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Because I think it's
absolutely.
easy. There's certain personalities in kids that they're just ready for anything. So it's easy to assume, oh, well, they're fine. But
Yeah.
then it can rear its ugly head in ways that maybe we're not ready for. So, what are some of those things that we can be looking for that, yeah, we maybe don't intuit?
Yeah, so a couple of different things. The first is to think through the idea of a pre-griever and a post-griever. So it's a continuum. Nobody's entirely a pre-griever or a post-griever, but everyone falls somewhere on that spectrum.
Yeah.
And when you know that your kid tends to be a pre-griever or a post-griever, you can care for them a little bit more intentionally and just yourself be more aware of like, I know what's coming, sort of a thing.
Yeah.
So pre-grievers, they anticipate a coming loss and they do the bulk of their grieving before it happens. So they're the ones that are going to have a really hard time leaving, a really hard time
Mhm.
saying goodbye. And it's usually those ones that parents are like, oh no, this is not going to go well. But
Right.
as soon as you get there, they've done their grieving. So they jump
Mm,
in and they're ready to go and they're pretty much good to go. Post grievers are kind of the dream child at the beginning of transition. They're the ones that are really excited about it, that are all looking forward to things. And you even sometimes notice these kids kind of not even really being sad about saying goodbye. Maybe they'll give their friend a hug, say, all right, see you later, that sort of thing. And they don't seem like they even are expressing appropriate emotions that you would think for the situation.
yeah.
But likely because they're a post griever, so it just hasn't hit them yet. They experience the bulk of their grieving when they feel the loss, not in anticipation. And so they can take quite a while. Like you said, one of yours 9 months later was having a really hard time. And it's because it sometimes takes a while to get to the point of feeling that loss. It takes a while of not having those friends around to realize how much you miss them, or not having that food or that smell or whatever it is. And so it usually comes up later. And that's usually something that tends to concern parents. And I often will have parents say, I don't know what's going on. She was just fine. It's been a year that we've been back, and now everything is kind of crashing. Well, it's really likely that this is just the bulk of the grieving process that's happening right now.
Yeah.
And it's really important that when that's happening, we allow space for it, and also don't automatically assume that it's an issue, that it's clinical depression, like anything like that.
Yeah.
It may just be that if you haven't seen that kid grieve yet, and now it's 9 months later, and all of a sudden you're seeing it, it's just grief. It's just sad because it's catching up to them for the first time, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think, we all have these markers in our host countries. Like, I know we were
Mhm,
kind of plugging along for a little bit until we were in China for 15 years, till Chinese
mhm,
New Year came up. And
mhm.
especially during COVID, because it was like, well, I guess we're just doing something at home. And we, all of us, kind of resurfaced this grief that we weren't expecting. But yeah, so it can resurface at weird, wonky times. And that was one of the questions that one of the mothers left on our Never Home group. Is she asked that, like, how do we know when we should step in? Like, our kids are really struggling, and I think we as parents have to balance, like, well, this is hard, we just got to work through it, and okay, this is getting to a point where we might need to find a counselor, find a third party to step in. How, I know it's going to be situational, but maybe what are questions we can be asking as parents when
Mhm.
we aren't sure? Like, do we intervene or do we let them process?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is to definitely give space for that processing. One of the things that I talk about a lot, and it's in my book, The Grief Tower, is the idea of anytime that you know your kids are grieving and they share it with you, or you just notice that you affirm, acknowledge, and comfort. So you affirm your feelings, even though it's 9 months later, those are real, valid emotions. It is
Yeah.
reasonable that you would feel sad. You acknowledge that they either shared it with you, or acknowledge that you've noticed it in their behavior, or acknowledge that you appreciate that they're willing to be open with you, whatever it is that you're acknowledging. And then you comfort them in whatever way they would receive that. So whether that's just a quick rub on the back if it's a teenager, or it's something where you take them out for a special date, whatever it is that's comforting to them, that would be a good follow-up. But it's really important that you do those things, and that in a sense is intervening. You are doing something. That's really important. So there's a difference between not getting too involved, and also you don't want to be so standoffish that they feel like you're also not caring. And so it's really important to do that affirming, acknowledging, and comforting no matter what.
Yeah.
And then the kind of line, if you could call it that, between when this is like normal grief, normal hardship of moving and transition, and COVID, let's be honest, that adds
You're
a whole
right.
other layer.
Yeah.
So kind of the line is when you notice that it's turning into what's called toxic stress. So
Okay.
the idea of toxic stress is that their brain physically has been in what's called the red zone for too long a period of time. So if it gets to the point where you notice that that kid, you would describe it and maybe just mentally visualize that that kid seems like he's been underwater for too long a period of time, and usually a good indicator for transition. So this is another thing that with counseling gets tricky, because if you take them to a counselor, they'll say, well, if it's been longer than 2 weeks, it's depression. Perhaps. I'm a big believer that that doesn't qualify for TCKs.
Yeah.
We're kind of the exception to that rule. But I usually say if it's been longer than 3 months, then you would start to be concerned about toxic stress. And the idea is that there's been too much stress on the brain, too much adrenaline and cortisol, to be specific, for too long a period of time, that it actually does start to cause problems. Some ways that you can notice that and look for that are if you start to notice, again, for over 3 months, really abnormal behavior. So either over engaging or disengaging. So maybe with a younger kid, it's like clinginess, and that doesn't stop after a few months. Maybe it's disengaging. They don't want you to touch them, that sort of thing. And again, it lasts for a while. Any sort of developmental reverting. So with younger kids, this could look like they were potty trained and now they're having accidents all the time. It could look like they're seemingly not learning. So that's another big one. If in transition, again, for more than 3 months, it seems like they just cannot learn anything, like at school, they're not getting good grades, their teachers are concerned, that sort of thing, that's an indicator of toxic stress. So that's kind of the line of, yes, it's good and important to grieve and have that season of grief. But when it goes on for too long, that's when it starts to negatively impact the brain. And so we have to, as parents, be intentional about looking for that. But then also, one of the very, very best ways, and this is proven with a bunch of research, to get them essentially up for air. So if you imagine they've been underwater for a while, to pull them back up for air is to get them to laugh and have fun. So I will usually assign families that I'm working with whose children are in transition or are really having a hard time. I'll say, okay, you need to plan one night a week where you're going to do a fun family thing. It doesn't matter what it is. You can have a pillow fight. You can have a picnic on the floor. You can have a movie night, whatever it is. Your only goal is to get them laughing. That is your only goal for that night, because you can even visualize, okay, they have come up for air. They might go down underwater again, but they're going to come back up for air next Friday or whatever it is. But that is so, so important, because when they're laughing, and I'm such a visual person, and I know other people are as well. So this is helpful for me. But you can almost picture, like, if their brain is flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, as soon as they start laughing, it just goes away. It just turns off and says, oh, okay, I don't need to do that right now.
Yeah.
And it gives their brain that break. And so that's super helpful no matter what age they are. So whether they're 2 or teenagers, That's a really, really important thing.
Yeah, we had a doctor, one of my children was had some medical stuff, and he said, "We need to teach your body. It does not have to be in fight or flight or freeze mode anymore." Like, but it takes like you're saying, it takes like rewiring and reworking and so I think too it's easy to think that this stage of toxic stress starts when we get to the States. But
Mm.
I think we as parents have to remember, I mean, the clock, it could be a year of toxic stress from the field, and now we're, coming to the States. So it's not as if the clock starts when we move to America, I guess is my point.
Yeah. Which really requires you knowing your children and having a
Yeah,
really good um, emotional pulse on them. So you
yeah.
know, okay, he's been since however long before, or we know she's been great, but now this is when she started. So that's so, so important to have that emotional pulse on each of your kids so that you know when their clock started too.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to transition to something that I think um, is common for kids, and I do want us to break this down into young kids, maybe middle school, high school, and then college. And I want to pick your brain for a second. Is friendships. So
Yes.
in China, my kids, the way they introduce themselves is, "Hi, I'm so and so, and I am 10 years old." And then sometimes like this is where I fall in the order of children because we have five kids.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
that's a super awkward way to introduce yourself to a friend at recess or at church. So what are some ways? Let's start with elementary school. What are some helps that you walk parents through in teaching their kids how to make friends in
Mhm.
maybe I should broaden it to North America, but
Yeah. So, one really helpful phrase that I like to teach kids is something called watch, think, guess, and act. And
okay.
the idea is learning how to observe. So, you can give your kids an assignment to do this. You can just practice it with them while you're out and about. With teenagers, they can do it on their own. But the idea is that you're going to watch other people and see what they do. So, you're going to look and see how other kids introduce themselves. You're going to think, all right, well, is that how people introduce themselves here? So then you're going to guess, okay, I'm going to guess that this is what I should do. And then you're going to act on it and see how people respond.
Mm,
And so it's just a really good observation method. And that's true not just for introducing yourself, but anything when you're in a new environment of
yeah.
how can I watch, think, guess, and act before I engage, before I act, I guess, watch, think, and guess before I act.
Right.
And really take the time to see what's going on. To be completely honest, a lot of the time, by the time TCKs are teenagers, they're really good at that because they're
Hmm.
really adaptable. And so they just automatically do that. But the younger that they are, or maybe if they haven't done a lot of transitioning within even their TCK life, then that would be something to teach and kind of work on and work through. As far as actually making friends, so one thing that I teach on a lot is something called the identity anchor. And the idea is that while you are so adaptable, which is a great TCK benefit, what are the things about you that stay anchored no matter what, that don't
Mm,
change no matter who you're with and where in the world you are? So, those things would be things that you enjoy doing, things that you believe, the things you think are important. Those things shouldn't change. And those also end up being the connection points that you'll have to other people. And so, for a young kid, I would say something like, okay, so playing with Legos is something that's on your identity anchor. Awesome. So your job when you go to school tomorrow is to see if you can find another kid who also likes to play with Legos.
mm,
And then they automatically have that connection point. With teenagers, maybe you look for somebody who also likes to listen to the same kind of music or who also does the same sport, which that becomes really easy when you can enroll them in activities, that sort of thing.
mm,
But the idea is you're helping them find connection points with other people. And often for TCKs, it feels like it's not the reality, which is why we're doing this, but it feels like it's hard to find those connection points when you
Yeah.
are a TCK coming back to your passport country where you're supposed to belong, but you don't actually. And so it's hard to feel like I can connect with these people. But when you give them almost that formula of, all right, you only have to find somebody who also
Mhm.
likes to paint,
Yeah.
that gives them a thing to look for. And they can also start to ask their potential friends questions. So, do you like art? If they say yes, sweet, I found my person.
Yeah.
And maybe that works, maybe it doesn't, but it ends up being a really helpful tool for them.
Yeah, and becomes probably a little bit less overwhelming that, okay, you've got these 100 sixth graders and you just have to get to know them, you know? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really good. One of the things I know, it was day 2 of my children being in school last year in America for the first time. And they were really frustrated because they said, I don't even have like a best friend yet. And I went, this child was in 7th grade at the time. And so it
Mhm.
took a little bit of processing because TCKs tend to make friends with each other really, really quickly. They go to conferences, and at the end of a 4-day conference, they've got a best friend and they've made necklaces together and they've exchanged emails and all these things. And it just doesn't work that way. And so I think what you're saying here is helpful in that respect too, because it does, even when you're sharing hobbies, it takes a little while to, to learn to engage each other, even if you have common interests.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing that I tell TCKs a lot, especially older TCKs. So when they're younger, they do tend to connect a little bit more quickly and easily. But the older that they get, the more I encourage them over and over, just be patient and stay
Mm,
curious.
yeah.
Because it's really easy and tempting to decide. And to be completely honest, I still have this that I have to remind myself of all the time when I'm in a new place. And we just moved at the beginning of COVID, so right in March a year ago.
Oh no.
And that's something that I have to remind myself of too, is be patient and stay curious, because it's really easy when you don't connect quickly with somebody to write them off. And
Yeah.
you're no longer curious, you're no longer asking questions. You're like, well,
Yeah.
they're not going to be the one for me. And it's really important to keep reminding our TCKs, be patient, stay curious, because
Yeah.
eventually it will happen, but it is slower. It is a lot slower, and that's hard. And it's,
Yeah.
again, that affirming, acknowledging, and comforting works there too. It is hard, and I know that it makes you feel sad, and I know that it's frustrating, all those
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, absolutely. And to remind, sometimes my kids have struggled with, they only think people who have been overseas, at least traveled, are the interesting ones. Like if you've stayed local and you've never moved, that like you're kind of boring. And so we've had to work through a lot of that. Like these are still interesting people, you know. Um, and so talking them through that, one of the things that we did as a family that I found really helpful is we looked up some materials about working with children who are on the autism spectrum to teach them how to ask intentional questions. And
Yeah.
so, because for children on the spectrum, you have to just learn these questions.
Mhm.
And so that has been really helpful. So, to teach our kids, like, this is an appropriate personal question in America. Like, we contextualize it all to America. Like, asking someone how much money they make is not appropriate. Asking them how much they weigh is not appropriate. But we had to just teach it almost like there would be a quiz at the end of the day,
Yeah.
because it doesn't necessarily come naturally to kids, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I love that you're intentional about that, because sometimes for parents it can feel like, well, they should know these things, especially if they didn't move when they were super young or before they were born, that sort of thing. And parents just assume that, well, now we're going back to
Mm,
our kind of home. And so they should remember or should know or should be able to adapt quickly, all those sorts of things. And I always encourage families, pretend that you are entering a completely foreign culture to your kids, just like you did when you moved to the other country. You didn't assume that your kids would know how to act, what to say,
Mm,
any of those things. It was a learning and teaching process. And do the exact same thing going back to your passport country, because it really is the same thing. You do have to learn it all over again. And it's really important to, I guess, acknowledge to your kids that they don't have to know it intuitively, which is something
mm,
that I know a lot of TCKs struggle with, is feeling like even their parents think that they should know it intuitively and they
mm.
don't. And so that just creates, again, even more disconnect between the kids and the parents, which is not what we want. We want them to feel understood by their parents.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's really good. Okay, last question, because I know you're busy, and then I want to hear from you on some resources we can give people. So this is my last question is, how do we help our kids balance the my host country hung the moon and now I hate America, or the reverse, like everything,
Yeah.
my host country is awful and now I love this, like this kind of, it has to be really a love or a hate. So how do
Yeah.
we, what are some ways that we can talk them through it can be a both and in a healthy way?
Yeah. So, one thing that I do a lot with families and encourage families to do a lot are a lot of what if conversations. So,
Mm,
what if we had stayed in America your whole life? What would be the good parts about that? And what would be the hard parts? What if we stayed in China for
mm,
forever? What would be the good parts? What would be the hard parts? What if we moved to a different country every year? What would be the good parts? What would be the hard parts? So,
mm,
a lot of what if questions, because you want them to start thinking through the idea that there are good things and hard things about every way of doing life, not just every place, but every lifestyle in that regard, every way of living life, whether you're globally mobile, whether you're in one place. And that's also really helpful for that idea of people who've only lived in America their whole lives can't possibly be interesting,
right.
because you start to think about, well, what if we had stayed here for forever? What would be the good things? Well, I'd
Yeah.
have people who knew me my whole life. I would have been able to do this
Mm.
or that. And so that's something that is a really good conversation to keep having, is all those what ifs and thinking about pros and cons of all the different ways of doing life.
I love that. I think that's really, really good. It stretches their brains to think past kind of the obvious stuff,
Hmm.
you know. Okay, I
Yeah.
wanted to give you a chance to talk about real quick any resources we should be aware of through you guys, through TCK training. You mentioned your book, but I want you to mention it again um,
Yeah.
for everyone, and then I'll make sure to try and link some of these things in the comments as well.
Awesome. So, um, I'll run you through. I have tons of resources, but I won't give all. I won't give a spiel on all of them, or we'll be here for a
Okay.
long time.
Yeah, yeah.
But I have two books. So the first is Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids. And that's kind of an overview of TCK care. It's written for parents and those who work with TCKs on really giving that practical TCK care, not just theory.
Yeah.
I'm really big on what do I actually say and do. So it's
Yeah.
all about that. The other book is The Grief Tower. So that goes into specifically grief processing with your TCKs. So those are the two books. Some really great family resources. I have curricula for families for ages 4 to 12, and then another one for 13 to 18. And that one has a teen workbook as well. And those
Mm,
curricula are, you can imagine like homeschooling about your TCK self. So it goes through talking about identity and grief and loss and subconscious expectations and all these different things that, again, we know
mm,
TCKs in adulthood tend to struggle with. And so
yeah.
we want to break it down and talk about it on their level in really fun ways. So there's activities and crafts and games and lots of family activities. I'm really big on whole family unit care and working on things
Yeah.
all together. So mom and dad have to answer the questions too, or play the game also, that sort of thing. So those curricula are available. The other thing that I have that TCK training does are something called family care packages. And these are for families who want some more intentional care. Maybe that's not something that your agency provides or something that you felt is lacking. And what it is you get a monthly hour phone call where we talk about, there's a questionnaire that goes out before. So we talk about kind of the things that are coming up, the things that have happened in the last month, and how you can care well for your TCKs in that moment, in that season. So you get a monthly phone call. You also get all the workshops, and the family curricula comes with that. It's kind of the whole shebang. But those family care packages, we have another round of applications opening for those next month, and care will start September 1st.
Okay.
So there's only a few spots, but that's something coming up that would be available. And then finally, I have workshops all the time on different topics. I have different teachers sometimes, that sort of thing. And there's a parent subscription that's $17 a month, and that gives you access to all the workshops and the recordings of the archives. So you get to see all the ones that maybe you couldn't attend live or that sort of thing as well. So those are some parent options.
Yeah, that is super helpful. And like I said, I will link some of these things. You're in this group, and so people can reach out to you if they, have questions or want follow up or whatever. But I mean, I could ask you a million things about TCK. So I really appreciate you, just sharing with us and helping us to know like all is not lost. I think it can feel in the midst of transition and our own grief that it can be overwhelming to also juggle each of our kids individually in the way that they're going through it. And so I like how you are breaking these things down into bite-sized pieces. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate you giving your time to us to talk us through some of this stuff. So thank you, Lauren.
Absolutely. My heart is to empower you and not overwhelm you. So
Yeah.
don't feel overwhelmed. Bite-sized pieces are what I'm all about. So yes, thank you so much for having me. And again, like you said, I'll be in the group, so feel free to reach
Okay.
out if you have any questions.
That sounds great. Thanks.